I am the punishment of God. With these words, Genghis Khan declared his divine mission. Historians still argue about his motives and the degree to which belief or pragmatism drove him, but his childhood remains an essential starting point. Betrayal hardened him, hunger sharpened him, and the struggle to survive taught him how to bind others to his will. Bringing those beginnings into focus changes how we understand his empire. It was not only conquest, but the psychological forging of a boy into a ruler, feared across continents. His story starts with a wound that reshaped the world, a life whose early episodes are known mostly from the secret history and later chronicles, which are always read with caution. We'll follow 3 crucibles: abandonment, betrayal, and invention, and show how each became a tool of his empire. And it begins with the first wound, a childhood of betrayal. Betrayal first entered Temujin's life, not through enemies, but through the collapse of his own world. His father, Iesuge, was poisoned while traveling, and the moment he died, the fragile protection of their clan dissolved. The Boyarjin turned away, leaving his widow and children to the mercy of the steppe. Much of what we know of this childhood comes from the secret history of the Mongols, a near-contemporary account that blends memory, oath, and myth, so parts remain contested. But the central picture is stark. A boy of 9, stripped of allies, forced to measure every step against hunger and fear. On the steppe, abandonment was a sentence of near death. Without a herd, a family had no future. Temujin's mother and siblings scoured the grasslands for roots, trapped small animals, and pulled fish from icy rivers. They lived closer to foraging bands than to proud herders. The cold was constant, the wind was sharp, and every winter carried the threat of starvation. For Temujin, each hunger pang was a reminder that trust could vanish in an instant, and that survival meant enduring without safety nets. Yet hardship ran deeper than weather. Inside the small camp, rivalry simmered. His half-brother, Bether, sometimes called Begter in the sources, was older and by custom held precedence. In a family where every scrap of food had to be fought for, that claim was not ceremonial. It meant less for the others, and it pressed hard on their already thin survival. Eventually, Temujin and his younger brother viewed Bether not just as kin, but as a competitor they could not afford. The secret history records the brutal outcome. Temujin stuck Bether down. It was not framed as destiny or grand design. It was an act born of scarcity and tension, enforced by the unforgiving logic of the steppes. In taking his half-brother's life, the young Temujin asserted his standing within his fractured household, showing that even family ties yielded before the raw need to survive. From this moment, he carried a lesson that shaped his future. Historians caution against reading too much philosophy into the act, but the pattern is clear. Weakness brought danger, and authority survived only when held beyond question. Temujin grew to view disloyalty and fragility as mortal risks, things to be rooted out before they spread. This conviction would harden into his later demand for absolute loyalty, enforced without hesitation. Hunger did not fade, nor did loneliness ease. But resilience forged itself against these pressures. What the wider tribe saw as a widow's forgotten son became, season after season, a youth tempered like iron. He had no cavalry to his name, no banners, no standards to rally, yet his greatest weapon was already forming a code where loyalty was unbending and disobedience carried final costs. The abandonment of his clan and the killing of his half-brother gave him a harsh initiation into the politics of survival. In time, that code would extend far beyond his family, binding men from rival clans and offering them something sturdier than bloodlines, the promise of protection in return for submission. But even in these early years, Temujin knew that trust had to be enforced, and that any bond could collapse without discipline. These lessons marked his first encounters with betrayal, yet kinship was only the beginning. Beyond his circle of siblings lay allies who swore eternal friendship, men who seemed closer than brothers, and it was there, in the fragile world of oaths and rival ambition, that betrayal would cut even deeper, the blood brotherhood and its rupture. For Temujin, the next decisive test came not from enemies abroad, but from the friend who had once seemed closer than family, Jamukha. As boys, the two had sworn an oath of blood brotherhood, a bond that in steppe tradition carried the weight of sacred trust. It promised that each would defend the other, share fortune and misfortune, and rise together. For a time, their alliance gave substance to the long-desired dream of steppe unity. Together they gathered men, herds, and weapons, combining scattered bands into a force large enough to challenge rivals who had once scorned them. In those first years, side by side, Temujin and Jamuka appeared as the twin pillars of a new order on the plains. Yet, as their ambitions grew, so did their differences. Jamuka clung to precedent. He believed leadership should rest on noble blood and inherited status. Temujin, hardened by the abandonment of his youth, took a different path. He sought out talent wherever it appeared, promoting men for skill and loyalty rather than ancestry. This division of principles soon spilled into the division of followers. Those who valued age-old prestige rallied behind Jamuka. Those ready for change gathered behind Temujin. The fracture widened until it broke into open conflict. Their partnership imploded, and by 1187 the split erupted into the Battle of Dalan Balyut, where Jamuka fielded a large army and crushed Temujin decisively. It was the end of their brotherhood, and it was the beginning of a bitter civil war that would define both men. Victory, however, revealed the darker side of Jamuka's rule. Accounts from the time describe how after the battle he seized 70 men who had once fought for Temujin and had them boiled alive. Whether in full or in part, this contemporary claim shocked the steppe and carried long echoes. It presented Jamuka not as a unifier, but as a tyrant whose cruelty bred fear faster than loyalty. For Temujin, the lesson was viciously plain. Trust that relied on blood and kinship could not endure. A stronger discipline and harsher justice would be required. In defeat, Temujin rethought his whole approach. He had witnessed firsthand the power of numbers built on lineage, and the weakness when those bonds broke apart. From then on, he rooted his leadership in loyalty to himself rather than to any clan or family. To disobey or betray him became not a private slight, but an offense punishable by death. Followers soon knew that submission brought rewards, but hesitation could not be tolerated. Years later, fortune turned and Jamuka fell into Temujin's hands. Among Temujin's followers, there was expectation that their leader would personally strike down his most hated foe, paying back betrayal with his own blade. But he declined to take the vengeance in person. Sources disagree on what followed. Some claim Jamuka was smothered in a carpet, others that he was cut apart. What all traditions agree upon is that Temujin ordered his death and stood apart from the act, keeping distance from his rival's blood. It was not forgiveness but calculation, proof that even with an enemy bound by old oaths, personal feelings would never outweigh the larger vision. From this ruin of friendship came renewed clarity. Temujin recognized that unity could not rest on fragile ties of ancestry or fleeting sentiment. Only absolute loyalty, imposed with discipline and reinforced by fear and reward, could sustain power across the steppe. The Anda oath had failed, but through its failure, Temujin defined the new foundations. A supra-tribal obedience where men of all lineage could rise, provided they bound themselves unconditionally to him. In the ashes of betrayal, Temujin discovered the principle that would guide his rise. The old tribal bonds were broken. In their place, he began to imagine a different structure, one built on order, merit, and obedience that surpassed family or blood. And soon as chieftains assembled in council to decide the fate of the steppe, that vision would take its first enduring form, forging the Mongol war machine. In 1206, the balance of the steppe shifted. At a great Kurultai, the chieftains acclaimed Temujin as Genghis Khan, a title many take to mean universal ruler. Yet names alone did not command obedience. The deeper achievement lay in what he built, a new system that reshaped tribes of herdsmen into the sharpest war machine of their age. For centuries, Mongol families had lived in cycles of rivalry and betrayal, tied to bloodlines that dissolved in quarrels. Genghis Khan broke that pattern. Instead of rallying on clan loyalties, he imposed new bonds of service. The answer was a reorganization that cut through old traditions. He divided his followers into fixed military units, the decimal system of tens, hundreds, and thousands. An arban held 10 men, 10 arbans formed a jagun of 100, 10 jaguns made a minghan of 1,000, and 10 minghans became a tumen of 10,000. Each group drew from multiple clans, serving ties of kinship and forcing men to fight side by side with strangers. Transfers were forbidden. Loyalty no longer rested on blood alone, but on obedience to the Khan. Promotion further shook the old aristocracy. Officers rose not because of their birth, but because of proven skill and loyalty. A herdsman's son had as much chance as a noble if he showed talent. For example, Subutai, the son of a blacksmith, became one of the greatest strategists in Mongol history, commanding campaigns thousands of miles from the steppe. His career sent a blunt message. Ability mattered more than ancestry. The same principle applied to spoils. Genghis Khan took no more than any of his men. Booty was shared equally, a radical check on aristocratic privilege. For warriors who had once been ignored by noble families, this fairness bound them tightly to him. But it also bred resentment among old allies who saw their status diluted by men they once considered beneath them. At the heart of the system stood the Keshig, the imperial guard, expanded to 10,000 men. They were his bodyguards, companions, and household servants. Drawn from across tribes and often including the sons of commanders, they served both as hostages and apprentices. Living close to the Khan, they learned his ways, earned his trust, and received privileges rare on the steppe. The Keshig was more than protection. It was a living symbol of the new order, showing others that loyalty and service could bring you into the center of power. The reforms gave structure to mobility. Every able-bodied man between 15 and 70 had a place in the ranks. Units could ride 70 miles in a day, then turn and strike again before enemies recovered. Strict punishments, execution for desertion, death for disobedience kept the army intact even on brutal campaigns. The organization fused with mobility, transforming scattered riders into a single engine of conquest. Cause followed effect. Reorganization dismantled tribal splits. Meritocracy promoted talent from every level of society. Booty shared equally and discipline tightly enforced created a loyalty that bypassed clan identity and tied men to the Khan alone. Each reform fed the next until the Mongols moved as one. The result was staggering. What had once been a patchwork of quarreling clans became one machine, able to strike across deserts, forests, and mountains. Its strength lay not in numbers alone, but in the unyielding structure that every warrior understood and obeyed. Discipline turned mobility from a custom of herdsmen into a weapon that could shatter kingdoms. This was the foundation of Genghis Khan's power, an army built out of order, opportunity, and fear of failure. Yet structure alone did not bring empires to their knees. To confront the fortified cities beyond the steppe, another weapon was needed, one that struck not just the body, but the mind. Terror as strategy. How did the horsemen of the steppe master what had undone so many before them? Against walls of stone, they found their answer not only in borrowed machines, but in fear itself, terror shaped into strategy. The Mongols had not grown among cities. Their life was the bow, the herd, and the plain. Yet when they rode into northern China or Central Asia, they met ramparts higher than any rider, and towers bristling with defenders. For nomads used to open combat, such defenses could have spelled limits. Instead, Genghis Khan absorbed what he lacked and weaponized dread where walls might have stopped him. They kept and employed captured siege engineers and craftsmen, Chinese, Persian, and others who brought with them both skill and technology. It was from these men that the Mongols learned to build catapults and mangonels, to raise towers, and even to employ early gunpowder devices. The tools once meant to keep invaders out now pried open the very gates they defended. But siegecraft alone did not explain their success. Contemporaries noted how the Mongols paired new machines with deliberate campaigns of psychological violence. Contemporary accounts record the use of prisoners as human shields in assaults, and of several heads catapulted over walls, not as acts of rage, but as calculated warnings. At the same time, mercy was equally strategic. Cities that chose to submit, pay tribute, and open their gates were generally spared, proof that obedience bought safety. The choice was made stark. Resist and face destruction, comply and survive. No example shows this policy more clearly than the war with Khwarizm, where Khwarizm officials killed Genghis's trade caravan and later his envoys. That act provoked the annihilative campaign that toppled the Khwarezmian state. Mongol armies advanced through its cities with systematic force. Towns were emptied, fields burned, populations uprooted. Each act of devastation carried a message that defiance was futile, and insult would be answered with annihilation. The effect spread faster than the armies themselves. Rumors of destruction traveled the caravan roads ahead of the riders. Traders spoke of entire towns put to the sword, of execution pits filled with thousands. Stories of one city crushed persuaded the next to surrender without a fight. Walls might stand and gates might lock, but defenders often melted away rather than face what they believed awaited them. Fear itself had become a weapon, collapsing resistance without the need for battle. Such methods invite judgment, but they were no accident. To Genghis Khan, terror served a precise function. It reduced the casualties his men would suffer in prolonged sieges. It shortened campaigns and it extended his reach. In sparing some and annihilating others, he crafted a reputation as potent as any weapon in his arsenal. Each conquest carried a lesson to the next, saving Mongol lives by convincing many opponents to yield without a fight. The results shook the medieval world. Temples, palaces, fortresses that had endured generations capitulated at first sight of his banners. Formerly proud rulers entered for peace before a single arrow flew. From the Mongols, conquest spread not through overwhelming numbers, but through the collapse of enemy will. So the nomad who grew up without walls learned how to break them by borrowing machines, mastering terror, and turning psychological shock into strategic advantage. And yet beyond ruined cities and smoldering fields, the question remained. What held such an empire together once fear had done its work? Genghis Khan's empire was not built by force alone. It rose from the wounds of his youth. Betrayal forged loyalty, hunger drove invention, and fear became order. Each scar carried forward, and each became a tool of power. His story is more than conquest. It is survival raised to combat. The boy left to starve on the steppe became the ruler at whose name cities surrendered. Historians still argue whether his methods outweigh his results. He left both devastation and a reconnected Eurasian world. The Pax Mongolica, with trade, communication, and religious tolerance across vast distances. He was both a ruthless product of his name and a radical state builder. That complexity is why his shadow endures. If this reframed Genghis Khan for you, tell us which childhood episode surprised you most, and subscribe for more balanced deep dives like this.